She walked into the school like a shadow crossing a stage before the lights come on, silent, unnoticed, almost fragile. Her shoes barely made a sound against the polished floor of the hallway, yet something about her presence made a few heads turn, not from awe, but from the instinctive curiosity that always surrounds the unfamiliar. The new girl, small frame, oversized hoodie, eyes that avoided contact as if she'd learned the hard way not to expect kindness, was clearly not prepared for the battlefield that high school could become. Her name wasn't on anyone's lips. No gossip preceded her, no friend sat waiting at the front office to show her around. She was alone, and it was obvious. She clutched her backpack like a shield, fingers pale with tension. When the receptionist asked for her name, she responded barely above a whisper, and the woman behind the counter barely looked up before handing her a schedule and pointing vaguely down the hall. First period was already halfway through. She slipped into class as the teacher droned on, and no one noticed her until she had to introduce herself. That was the moment, when her quiet voice floated in the room, that a few smirks began to spread like an infection. They picked up on her accent, on the way she said thank you too politely, like she was used to being invisible and grateful for even a crumb of attention. She took the seat in the far back corner, the place everyone avoids unless they want to disappear. And that's exactly what she seemed to want, to vanish, to be left alone. But the silence that cloaked her only made her more intriguing to the wrong kind of students. The ones who needed someone to mock, someone to push down so they could feel a little taller. By lunch, the whispers had already begun. She's so weird. Did you see her shoes? Probably homeschooled or something. She moved through the cafeteria like a ghost, carrying a tray that seemed too heavy for her thin arms, looking for a place to sit that wouldn't make her feel like a target. But in a cafeteria where every table had an unspoken rule and a social hierarchy carved in stone, there was no safe corner. So she chose a seat by the wall, her back to everyone, pulling out a worn book like it could shield her from the cruelty of adolescent judgment. She didn't look up when laughter erupted behind her. She didn't flinch when someone threw a balled-up napkin that landed beside her tray. She simply turned the page, eyes scanning the words like she'd read them 100 times before and knew them by heart. But her hands trembled, just slightly, enough to betray the truth. She wasn't invisible. Not really. They saw her. And already, the wolves had caught the scent. It started with the little things, the kind of cruelty that flies under the radar of adults but cuts deeper than anyone dares to admit. A shove in the hallway masked as an accident. A whisper behind her back, just loud enough for her to hear her own name twisted into a joke. A locker that wouldn't open because someone had jammed gum into the lock. She didn't react. Not with anger. Not even with fear. Just silence. A silence that wasn't surrender, it was a choice. And yet, that very silence only fed the fire in those who needed to see someone break in order to feel powerful. They began to circle her like vultures dressed in varsity jackets and fake confidence. A girl named Brooke led the charge, flanked by two others who always laughed half a second too late, like they needed permission. Brooke was the queen of nothing real, but in this place, that meant everything. She hated the new girl on sight, not for anything she'd done, but for what she refused to do. Beg for acceptance. One morning, Brooke, accidentally, knocked her books from her arms, letting them scatter across the hallway as students passed by without stopping. The new girl simply bent down and picked them up, one by one, hands steady, face unreadable. Brooke smirked, expecting tears or at least a flash of humiliation. But there was none. Only silence. And again, that choice not to respond. By the second week, the games escalated. They left cruel notes in her desk, mocking her accent, her clothes, even her silence. In gym class, they stole her sneakers and tossed them onto the roof of the storage shed. She walked home barefoot that day, but she didn't report it. Not to the teacher. Not to the office. Not even to the foster family she stayed with, who barely remembered she existed. But cruelty has a rhythm. It feeds off attention, grows when it senses weakness. And what they couldn't stand was that she gave them nothing. No flinching. No retaliation. No tears they could feed off like parasites. She just kept showing up. Quiet.
Composed.
Almost unnervingly calm. Then came the video. During lunch, someone took her backpack, dumped its contents on the floor, and started filming as she calmly picked up each item: her notebook, a cracked phone, a photograph folded and worn from too many hands. They expected her to snap, to scream, to cry. But she just gathered her things, eyes on the floor, while the camera laughed for her. They posted it that night, a video titled "Mute Mouse Gets Schooled." By morning, it had spread across every student's phone. And still she said nothing. But the thing about silence, real silence, is that it can hold a storm. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, that storm doesn't break. It chooses when to rise. And when it does, no one sees it coming. That morning, something shifted. It was so subtle that no one noticed at first. Not the teachers sipping coffee behind their desks, not the students half asleep in their chairs, and certainly not Brooke, who strutted into school still basking in the afterglow of the video's popularity. But in the eyes of the new girl, still silent, still watchful, there was a new weight.
Not sorrow. Not fear.
Something deeper. Measured. Ready. She walked through the hall with the same quiet footsteps, same unbothered expression, but those who looked closely, if anyone had bothered, might have sensed it. The quiet had changed. It was no longer retreat. It was reckoning. Brooke met her near the lockers, phone already in hand, ready for round two. She said something snide, something shallow and rehearsed, and the two girls behind her giggled on cue. The hallway wasn't crowded yet, but a few heads turned, people expecting a show. And for the first time, the new girl looked Brooke straight in the eyes and spoke. Just one sentence.
Low. Clear.
Unshaking. "You think I'm the one who should be afraid?" The words dropped like ice into the humid air. The laughter faltered. Brooke's grin twitched. For a moment, the whole hallway seemed to pause, like the world exhaled and forgot to breathe back in. Then she turned away.
Calm.
Controlled. As if the sentence had cost her nothing. As if she hadn't just redrawn the rules of the game without lifting a finger. That was the turning point. Or maybe the breaking point for everyone else. In the following days, strange things began to happen. Not cruel. Not violent. Just unexplainable. The video that mocked her was suddenly gone, scrubbed from every phone, every cloud, every backup. The account that posted it was deleted. And no one could remember how it had been uploaded in the first place. Brooke's Instagram, once a temple of selfies and snide captions, vanished overnight, replaced with a blank page and an error message. Then came the messages. Private. Anonymous. Sent to Brooke and her clique. Detailing things they thought no one knew. Screenshots of chats. Audio clips of their laughter at others' expense. Notes they'd written. Things they'd said in secret. Nothing edited. Nothing added. Just the truth, returned to them with precision and timing that felt surgical. Panic replaced pride. Brooke confronted the new girl in class one day, voice shaking, demanding answers. But the new girl didn't even look up from her notebook. She just turned a page and let the silence speak again. But this time, the silence wasn't passive. It was loaded, like a chambered round waiting for the right moment. Some students began to whisper, not about her accent or her shoes anymore, but about who she really was. Rumors spiraled, that she was some kind of hacker, that she'd been expelled from another school not for fighting but for exposing. That she wasn't just quiet, she was watching, calculating, choosing when to act. And she had acted, but not with fists. Not with cruel words or posts. She had held up a mirror and let them see themselves. No edits. No filters. Just the raw, painful truth of what cruelty looks like when it's no longer funny, when it's no longer safe behind a screen. They had tried to break her. But they didn't understand that some people don't break. They bend the whole system back. In the days that followed, the school seemed to move under a different kind of light, muted, cautious, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the tension left behind. Brooke stopped showing up for morning announcements. Her laughter, once the soundtrack of every hallway, had evaporated. Her friends had grown quiet, their eyes nervously shifting every time they passed a classroom door or the library window where the new girl often sat. Always alone, always serene, her presence like a silent gravity pulling truth into the open. It wasn't revenge. That's what made it so disarming. It was never loud, never chaotic. There were no confrontations, no yelling in the cafeteria, no dramatic confessions over the intercom. Just silence and the steady unraveling of everything fake, petty, and cruel. People began to talk, but not like before. Not with gossip or mockery. It was different now. Measured. Respectful. Some students even tried to sit beside her at lunch, offering apologies disguised as casual conversation. She listened, nodded sometimes, said very little. Her eyes were kind, but not soft. There was a strength behind them that made even the boldest boys drop their bravado. She had earned something not easily given in high school, dignity that demanded nothing but presence. The teachers noticed the shift too. Discipline cases dropped. Whispered rumors of bullying stopped mid-sentence. The principal, who had once ignored complaints for the sake of reputation, quietly began enforcing policies with new attention. The school's website suddenly had an updated anti-bullying statement. Assemblies were scheduled, featuring speakers talking about digital responsibility, about empathy, about silence and its different forms, not just the silence of being ignored, but the silence that speaks louder than cruelty. Some students began to reflect aloud. In classrooms, in journals, on social media, where vague captions gave way to honest posts. I was part of the problem. I thought it was just a joke. She didn't deserve that. One post simply read, "We all saw her. None of us knew what we were seeing." But perhaps the most profound shift was internal, in the girl herself. She still walked alone sometimes, but it no longer looked like solitude. It looked like peace. Like someone who no longer needed to hide her silence, because it had already spoken, and the world had listened. She didn't become popular.
She didn't need to.
Her power wasn't in likes or followers. It was in the way conversations changed when she walked by. It was in the sudden thoughtfulness of students who used to laugh first and think later. It was in the way Brooke never looked her in the eyes again. Not out of fear, but because shame had a weight too heavy for shallow apologies. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it was lasting. In the end, the girl hadn't come to conquer. She had simply refused to be erased. And in doing so, she redrew the story, not just hers, but everyone's. Not with noise, not with revenge, but with truth. Quiet, relentless truth. The final act unfolded not in defiance, but in grace. There was no grand confrontation, no cinematic showdown beneath the flickering lights of the gym. It happened slowly, quietly, like the last snow melting at the edge of spring, revealing something raw and honest and painfully human beneath. One afternoon, long after the noise had settled and the whispers had grown weary, Brooke stood hesitantly by the lockers, clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hand. Her eyes scanned the hallway, searching for the girl whose silence had undone everything she thought she controlled. When she finally found her, seated under the faded school banner with a book open across her lap, something in Brooke's posture broke. It wasn't the collapse of a villain. It was the collapse of a girl who had finally realized she had become one. She approached slowly, not with apologies rehearsed in the mirror, but with the awkwardness of someone who had never truly said "I'm sorry" and meant it. She offered the letter, without words. The girl looked up, not surprised, not smug, just calm, like she had already forgiven her long before this moment. There was a long pause. Then a simple nod. The girl reached out, not for the letter, but for something deeper, for closure, perhaps. Their hands didn't touch, but for the first time, Brooke didn't flinch under her gaze. There was no need to speak. Grace, after all, doesn't need to shout. In the days that followed, things didn't magically return to normal because normal had never been just. Instead, something better began to root itself beneath the surface. Students learned to look people in the eyes, to pause before speaking, to ask instead of assume. The cafeteria grew quieter, but it was the quiet of respect, not fear. Hallways that once echoed with mockery now held the rustling sound of caution, of conscience waking up. The girl remained who she was, private, grounded, unshakable, but her presence had softened. She offered help in class, volunteered for a group project, even smiled when someone asked to walk with her to the library. It wasn't surrender. It was her way of saying, I'm still here, still whole, still capable of choosing kindness, even when the world forgets how. The staff began to notice her in a new way, not as a problem to monitor, but as a compass others had begun to quietly follow. Even the principal, who had once dismissed complaints as adolescent drama, sought her out one morning to say thank you, not as an authority figure, but as a man humbled by what he had failed to see. By the time spring arrived, the school was different. Not perfect, not immune to cruelty, but more awake. And all because a girl who had every reason to disappear chose instead to stay. Not to seek revenge, not even to prove herself, but to remind them, without anger, without pride, that even the smallest voice, when spoken with truth and dignity, could ripple through a place like wildfire and leave behind something no storm could erase. Grace had won. Quietly.
Steadily.
Unforgettably.